The general view in the West is that Iran's attack on Israel was an abject failure. Whether or not it was a genuine attempt to wound the Israeli state or just a billion-dollar fireworks display, it didn't work. 99% of the drones and missiles were shot down by Israel's allies and its Iron Dome. Israel looks tough again, Iran looks weak. And after months of rebukes from its allies over the Gaza war, Israel's powerful friends have again made their allegiance clear. So what did Iran have to gain? Well, first things first, the Iranian regime is loathed by its own people. Enemies mean survival. It had to be seen to respond to the Israeli attack on its consulate in Syria. And to those who glibly say Iran has the right to defend itself and America would respond with force, which rock have you been living under? Iran has been poking the hornet's nest through proxies for years. Hezbollah attacks Israel from Lebanon in the north. The Houthis in Yemen have attacked vessels in the Red Sea more than 60 times in the last 6 months alone. Hamas began its diabolical war in Gaza by invading Israel with Iran's funding and full-throated support. Fundamentally, Iran doesn't believe Israel has a right to exist. It wants to encircle the country with paramilitary groups and ultimately dominate the region. But like all pariah states, it profits from chaos. Unlike all dictatorships, its people suffer the most. So what should the Western world do about it? Is this a moment for appeasement or power? Did the attack throw Netanyahu a lifeline? And how will the changing political winds impact the war on Gaza, where millions now face a famine? In a moment, we'll debate those big questions with Mustafa Barghouti, Fleur Hassan Nahum, and Francesca Fiorentini. But first, with a view from Tehran, Professor Mohammad Marandi joins me, who was previously an advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiations team. Well, Professor Marandi, thank you very much indeed for joining me on Uncensored.
Thank you for having me.
Obviously, I've outlined there my view about this situation. I'm sure that you would disagree with much of it, if not all of it. But what is the view from Tehran about what's happened here?
Yes, I think it's pretty fair to say I disagree with all of it. The view from Tehran is quite clear. You know quite well, I know quite well, your viewers know quite well that the Israeli regime is carrying out genocide. And this stems from an ethno-supremacist ideology. It stems from apartheid. And this is unacceptable. And the people who lived on that land, they have been expelled. The people in Gaza, they live in a concentration camp, now a death camp. And the West has brought about this situation. Whatever crimes that they've committed against Jews and Gypsies and Slavs, they have to pay for it themselves. They can't take it out on the Palestinian people. So the Iranians, along with almost everyone else in the world, except for some people in your part of the world, believe that the apartheid regime has to come to an end. And by coming to an end, it means that all people of that land have to be able to live as equal human beings. I know that sounds very crazy, but ethno-supremacism isn't a good thing.
But the position of the Iranian regime is that Israel shouldn't exist, right?
Well, the position of the British regime is that Israel as an apartheid state should continue to exist. The position of the American regime is Israel is...
If you could, look, that wasn't the question I asked you, but is the position of Iran's regime...
I'm answering.
That is, but what is the answer to that question?
I'm getting there. The position of the American regime is that apartheid should continue. Iran's position on South Africa had the same gap. There was the same gap back then. When the British and the Americans supported apartheid in South Africa and racial supremacism in the South African region, Zimbabwe today, and so on, back then Iran was supporting the indigenous population. Back then, Iran supported the ANC. Back then, Iran supported the military wing of the ANC and Nelson Mandela.
But we're not talking about South Africa. I'm talking about what is Iran's regime's current position in relation to Israel?
The Iranians believe that Israel does not have moral legitimacy as an apartheid regime. And the only way that it can gain legitimacy is that if apartheid is cast aside, if ethno-supremacism is cast aside, if racial and religious discrimination in the sense that Muslims and Christians are lesser human beings and they don't have any right to the land that they've been on for hundreds of years, that should be set aside. People who have been expelled have the right of return. It's not very complicated. It's not, as you say, rocket science.
Well, it may not be complicated to you, but what looks complicated to us is that what Iran has been doing in the last few years, if not decades, has been supporting via proxy groups like the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, funding and helping to train them to commit acts of war against Israel, firing endless rockets, and as we saw on October the 7th, committing an act of heinous terrorism. So it's not quite as simple as you're trying to picture this, is it? Iran has had a vested interest in supporting terror against Israel for a very long time.
No, I think the regimes that have a vested interest in supporting terrorism are the ones who are giving the Israeli regime the weapons to carry out genocide. And the genocide began long before October the 7th. And the Gaza Strip was a concentration camp long before October the 7th. You know as well as I that October the 7th didn't occur in a vacuum. And the terrorism has been carried out regularly by the Israeli regime on the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip for decades. It regularly bombed them and killed them. And it's not just the Gaza Strip. I think roughly 400 Palestinians have been murdered in the West Bank over the past 6 months. These are regular occurrences, but it doesn't register in the West because, again, the Israelis they are European. It's a European colony. They have priorities over the brown people of the land. But it is a fact that Palestinian children, according to the statements made by senior Israeli officials, Palestinian women, according to members of the Knesset, they are lesser people. If you look at the South African complaint, they clearly point out the views of these people and the starvation siege and the intention to starve the people of Gaza, women and children. That is because they look at them as inferior people. This is not about two armies. This is about a subjugated people trying to stand up for their rights. If you were in Germany,
and how would you? Let me ask you, Professor. How would you categorize what happened on October the 7th? Was that a terrorist attack?
No, it was a retaliation of a people who were imprisoned and who were starved and who were regularly battered, and people who were imprisoned.
So you think, just to be clear, you think that the slaughter of 1,200 people, the raping, the maiming, the incinerating, the mass murder that went on that day by a group whose own spokesman, the Hamas spokesman, said days after that, on television, on camera, that Hamas was wedded to committing the same act again and again and again, as often as it could, which actually is the purest personification of the genocide that you're talking about. You don't condemn that?
You're being dishonest. There is no evidence.
No, I'm not.
There's no evidence of rape, and I ask your viewers.
Absolute nonsense.
Yes, nonsense. It's absolute nonsense that there's systematic rape, and if you are being dishonest intentionally, you are helping the Israeli regime continue its genocide by justifying it through dishonesty. So that's up to you to decide. There's no evidence of systematic rape. And just like the beheadings,
there has been clear reported evidence of rape and sexual abuse against Israeli women. Clear, demonstrable evidence.
I refer you and your audience to the good work carried out by people at the Gray Zone, at the Electronic Intifada, based in the United States. Many of them are people of they're excellent reporters, and you should invite them on your show to talk about these allegations.
I've talked to top reporters who've covered this.
Talk to them too.
I'm also interested, Professor, that you only want to deny that there was rape. You don't want to deny the incineration or the beheadings or the mass murder of Holocaust survivors, the kidnapping of several hundred people, including babies. I mean, do you condemn any of that, or do you think all of that is justified?
Look, Piers, you're trying to play with words, and that's fine as long as you're not
What words am I
trying
playing
to
with?
just. Well, you're playing because there is no evidence of beheadings. You're just taking the dishonest Israeli regime's account, which they have no evidence, and people have written articles
there
about
was
this.
demonstrable, proven evidence that people were beheaded. Provable
Yeah, okay,
evidence.
that's-
And
so you're saying-
more than that, we know from Hamas's own video coverage of what they were doing in real time that they proudly broadcast to the world. They didn't try and hide this. I'm just curious why you, who is so incensed by what you see as Israeli genocide, why you would not be equally incensed by genocidal behavior from Hamas that day.
No, you're not being honest, and that's where did they broadcast this footage of beheadings, the Hamas, to the world? Can you put it right now where you have a
I didn't
crew
say
right
they
now?
broadcast the beheadings. There was evidence found of people who'd been beheaded. That was not broadcast. But
Can
what
you show
was
the footage?
broadcast was
Can you show the footage?
was the one. I didn't say there was footage of the beheading. I said there was evidence found that people had been beheaded, right? But I would also say to you that what was
There were
broadcast
cameras all
by
over the
Hamas, of Hamas slaughtering people and kidnapping people, I'm proudly boasting about it, something you seem to be smirking about. I'm just
smirking
curious
at
what
you.
feel.
I'm smirking at you.
Why?
Because you are clearly being dishonest. If there were people, innocent people, anywhere, whether in Palestine or elsewhere, who were killed by a soldier, by anyone, that is, of course, unacceptable. But then these claims of systematic rape and these claims of these are dishonest claims. People have done hard work to prove that there is no evidence for these systematic rapes and beheadings. And these were used as propaganda to justify the beginning of this Holocaust in Gaza. And those who continue to make these
You see, you
false
talk about me being
allegations-
dishonest, Professor. You talk about me being dishonest, but what you've just said is an absolutely shocking example of dishonesty. Hamas didn't even try to hide what they did. They made no secret of their delight, their joy, their pride in what they were doing. Some of them rang family members back in Gaza to boast about what they'd just done, to old women, to children. And I'm just curious why you can't find yourself able to condemn this.
In the day and age, Piers, in the day and age when everyone has cameras and there are cameras all over the place, show us the evidence. Show us the evidence. Especially in Israel, which is a society which has cameras all over the place. But you don't have footage of any beheadings and you don't have any footage of any rape. I wonder why.
Well, there were bodies found who had been beheaded. That is a fact.
So, okay, show them these bodies that have been beheaded. Show them on your show. Show those pictures.
How many people do you think were killed that day?
I think roughly 1,100, between 1,100 and 1,200. Many of them were soldiers.
So you accept there was a mass slaughter. Does that constitute genocide to you? Is that an attempt at genocide?
No, it's like you saying that the French resistance, which was operating against the Nazis, and they go and carry out an operation, and during that operation, some children are sadly killed. So you say, oh, so the whole French resistance is illegitimate, and the Nazis' occupation is legitimate. That's nonsense. If, as I said very clearly, wherever an innocent person is killed, that I condemn, everyone condemns, and I wish you would condemn, because a genocide is taking place. And you are putting forward claims without the justification to make them, without the evidence to make them. I would refer you again to those websites and those reporters and journalists who've proven that the claims were inaccurate, to say the least, and dishonest, most probably.
Let me turn to, well, we agree about this, so people can make their own minds up, but let me turn to the missile strikes that Iran launched against Israel, 300 of them, it was spectacularly unsuccessful. I mean, it caused barely any damage. Again, you're smirking, you can explain why, but it was a spectacular failure, wasn't it, by Iran? Just a load of showboating and throwing fireworks in the air with actually no result whatsoever, other than they hurt one little girl.
Of course, I'm smirking. It's funny the way in which you always frame things where the other and the non-Westerner is incompetent and incapable, and your fantastic Israeli allies are on top of their game. No, in fact, it was a major defeat for the Israelis and for the Americans. And why? Because the Iranians, from the very beginning, well, let me tell you. First of all, the Israeli regime carried out an airstrike on an Iranian embassy. The whole world condemned it. Forget the West, forget the UK and the US. You are marginalized. You supported it because at the UN Security Council, your regime, the American regime, and the French regime, they prevented the condemnation of the bombing of the Iranian embassy. So the world rallied behind Iran. And Iran said, we're going to retaliate. But what did Iran do? Iran played it very smart. They played 10 days of mind games with the Israeli regime, and then they declared that they're going to carry out the attack. So the Israelis and the Americans and everyone mobilized everything they had, and the Iranians sent hundreds of dirt cheap drones, a few $1,000s each, to fly, and it took 3 hours for them to get there. And then your Israeli allies spent, according to their own estimates, $1.35 billion to down drones that didn't cost probably $2 million for Iran. The Iranians did not use any of their new technology. It was all old technology. So the Israelis gained nothing, but the Iranians gained a huge amount of information about the capabilities of the Americans and the Israelis. And I must say that the most of the things were done by the Americans, not the Israelis or the British or the French. And then the Iranians sent a series of old missiles that they had in stock for a long time, none of it with the latest technology. And then again, the Americans and the Israelis attacked them with very expensive missile defense systems and use all their capabilities, giving the Iranians huge amounts of information. Again, a couple of $1 million. No one is going to buy those old missiles. And then Iran fired a handful alongside these missiles, a handful of serious missiles that were targeted at two bases, the two most heavily defended military sites in the world, an air base in the south and an intelligence gathering base, I think, in the north. And both of them received direct hits. So the Israelis they showed their hand. They spent a lot of money at a time when these missiles there's a huge shortage of them because of Ukraine. And the Iranians gave no information about their capabilities. Even those missiles
I've got to say that's one of the more entertaining explanations for such an abject failure that I've heard.
Should I smirk again?
And let me take you back to what Israel said they committed the bombing in Damascus for, was because they discovered that the building was diplomatic in name only and being used as an Iranian military and intelligence base, hence the presence of all these generals, two of whom were killed, along with all the others there. So if it was being used as a military base, and they were training Hezbollah, which is what they believed they were doing, then it was a legitimate target, wasn't it?
Well, of course, since you support the Israeli narrative and you are a friend of the people who are carrying out this Holocaust, this ongoing Holocaust, and you don't care about the people.
I don't support any narrative. I'm just asking you whether if it was being used as a military base, was it a legitimate target if they're training Hezbollah to attack Israel?
You have a rather one of the most extreme narratives, and I think you're doing a disservice to truth by
actually I don't at all. I've been very critical of Israel, but I don't believe. Whenever I interview people who can't find it in themselves to actually say what Hamas did on October the 7th, I always find it slightly incredulous then, whatever else they say, because we all saw what happened with our own eyes.
People are not intimidated by you. That's the problem. You can intimidate some of your own people, but you can't intimidate us.
I don't want to intimidate anybody. I want to get to the. I want to find out. I'm just fascinated. Okay, let me ask you this.
No, no,
I mean,
let me
okay,
ask you a
Professor, I'm not
question.
trying to be timid.
That is a
No,
diplomatic
you don't ask the
building,
questions.
just like the
I ask the
British.
questions.
That is no. I'm answering your question. That was a diplomatic building. You know quite well that the Israelis had no right to touch it. They committed a crime, and the Iranian retaliation was an act of self-defense. And your own foreign minister humiliated himself on Sky News, which is an outlet that is sympathetic to the regime, when he said, well, if one of our diplomatic buildings were struck, how would the response be? So don't be silly. The Israeli regime, they're always lying, just like the Al-Shifa hospital. They're full of underground tunnels. Where were the tunnels? And then at the beginning, when they struck the Al-Hili hospital and killed hundreds of people, they said, no, it was the resistance. And the Western intelligence agencies said the same thing. And then we saw them hit hospital after hospital after hospital after hospital. So you put your faith in the narrative of these child killers who bomb hospitals and destroy the very basis of humanity, the very basic needs for ordinary people in Gaza. Come on.
And yet here's the irony, Professor. Here's the irony, is that all the attention that was falling actually on Israel's war on Hamas in Gaza, and whether it was a massive overreach and whether too many civilians were being killed, and when we saw the aid workers killed, obviously enraged people as well, it was all heading the way that Iran would have liked, which is that it was general global outrage that was fermenting about what was going on there. Now, the narrative has changed, doesn't it? Because what we saw were countries like Jordan racing to help Israel defend itself against Iran's missiles, the ones that you've tried to dismiss but were actual missiles. And how does that help Iran's narrative that Israel are the bad people in the region when you have major Arab countries like Jordan and Saudi offering airspace and so on? How does that help your cause to try and isolate Israel? All you did was achieve the complete opposite, didn't you?
Absolutely not. First of all, the people of Jordan know that the Israeli regime considers the Palestinians to be Amalek. We're not dumb, Piers, and they're not dumb. The government of Jordan does not represent the people. You know this, and I know that. But more importantly...
Well, the government of Iran doesn't represent the Iranian people, does it?
It represents the Iranian people more than your government represents the British people. But the Iranians...
Actually, I wouldn't say that at all.
I would say that. The Iranians, when they carried out the strike, and by the way, just as well, I'll say that at the end. When the Iranians carried out the strike, they punished the Israeli regime and they humiliated the Israeli regime. But nothing is going to distract world public opinion from the Holocaust in Gaza. Don't think that the Israelis can do that. No one can do that. The Holocaust continues as we speak today. When the president of Brazil and other world leaders say what the Israeli regime is doing today to the people of Gaza is just like what the Nazis were doing in Germany, no one is going to forget because the Iranians retaliated.
Okay, let me ask you this. It's been reported. Well, no, I want to ask you something. It's been reported today that Israel is preparing to do a retaliatory strike against Iran in some capacity. We don't know how yet. And it's been said, not least by you, that if war spreads, have no doubt all American bases in the Persian Gulf region will be destroyed, and those countries that host American bases will be guilty by association. All those gas and oil installations will be destroyed by drones and missiles. I mean, that's sort of strong rhetoric, but the reality is that if Israel does strike Iran, it has a far more sophisticated and powerful military capacity. And if America was to defend it against any further retaliation of the kind that you're describing, then Iran would get wiped away, wouldn't it? I mean, you can't possibly compete with the combined military firepower of countries like Israel and America. Why would you pretend otherwise?
That's your wishful thinking. The Israeli regime is vulnerable and weak, and it has shown itself to be incapable of taking a dot on the map. They haven't been able to take Gaza after 6 months of genocide. They haven't been able to take even northern Gaza after 6 months of genocide. They have to withdraw at least 100 to 200,000 people from northern Israel because they cannot stand up to Hezbollah. They cannot push Hezbollah back. They cannot defeat them. So you think the Israeli regime is going to defeat Iran? Why is it that the Americans are concerned about any Israeli attack because they know exactly what will happen. Next time round, Iran won't be firing those old drones to gather intelligence and to empty the Israeli and the American missiles. Next time, the Iranians will be sending thousands of missiles and drones that are top-notch, and the Israelis will be punished severely. And the reason why the Americans don't want this is because they know that the balance of power has shifted. Piers, let me give you a word of advice. Your media outlets, regardless of whether Russia or Ukraine is good or bad, that is another issue. Your media outlets in the West have been misleading the people for 2 years now, saying Ukraine is winning, Ukraine is winning. Suddenly, everyone is saying Ukraine is falling apart. Dishonest narratives and reporting dishonestly to your own people ultimately hurt the people of England and Europe and the United States. And your endless wars based upon this nonsense and this misinformation lead to huge waves of refugees. And then the people of Europe feel overwhelmed by these refugees that you yourself brought upon yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would return the favour here by saying to you, I think you should wake up to the reality of what your regime is doing. Because it's pretty clear, I think, to anyone who has looked at the situation in its totality, that what Iran has been doing is a direct response to the normalization of relations with Israel, with a number of countries in the Middle East that annoys Iran intensely because they don't recognize Israel as a state. So what Iran has been doing is funding and fueling terror groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, to constantly attack Israel, because what they want to do, particularly with October the 7th, is to dismantle and destabilize any more normalization of Arab countries with Israel, particularly Saudi Arabia, who are on the verge of doing it, which is why I think the utterly self-defeating firing of all these missiles the other day actually had the complete opposite effect. Jordan raced to defend Israel, and Saudi offered airspace and also helped defend them as well. And when that happens, it isolates Iran, not Israel. But anyway, we're going to leave it there. Professor Marandi,
let me respond to that. Let me respond to that. Actually, it's the opposite. When the West continues to support the atrocities carried out by the Israelis, when the West openly supports an ethno-supremacist regime, and when the West supports genocide, the public across the region is turning not only against the Israeli regime, but against the West. A few families who are ruling over countries are not public opinion. And ultimately, by pursuing this, they are creating a rage that they cannot stop in future. And just one final point on a personal note. I experienced what the West does to the non-Western world. When your governments were supporting Saddam Hussein, when your governments were arming him in the 1980s, before you turned against him, your governments gave him chemical weapons. I survived two of those chemical weapons attacks. I survived both mustard gas, and I survived nerve agents that were provided by Western government to Saddam Hussein. And many people did not survive. The intentions of Western regimes are not benign. Your governments have done nothing but ruin and destruction for our part of the world and for much of the rest of the world. And now, because of the mess that you've created across the board, you're now ruining the lives of your own people.
Okay, well, just for the record, I was the editor of the Daily Mirror, which led the UK media campaign against the Iraq War
this
in
was
2003.
Before that.
So I know what you're saying. I'm just saying that I did that, and so your assessment of what I think about what has happened.
I know what you were doing.
Here,
I was at the anti-war protests in London at that time, actually. So I know what you did.
Right, but you were probably carrying a Daily Mirror banner because I know it's a complicated situation. Professor Marandi, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.